My parents cut me off during the hardest time of my life. They thought I was weak, a burden they didn't want to deal with. But years later, when their golden boys stole millions, they came crawling back to me. And by then, I had no reason to save them. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. When I think back to that season of my life, the memory still carries a sting sharp and cold, like pressing your hand against ice. I was in my 30s, not a naive girl anymore, but a woman who had weathered enough storms to know what family should mean. And yet, in my darkest hour, my own parents, those who should have been my safety net, my comfort, my compass, turned their backs on me without hesitation. It was the hardest time of my life. Though the reasons might sound painfully ordinary, a mix of circumstances that could happen to anyone. I had lost my job after the company I worked for downsized. At the same time, I was still paying off medical bills from a surgery the year before. Bills that seemed to multiply like weeds every time I thought I had cleared one. I was working side gigs, doing what I could to scrape together rent and utilities. But the math was never in my favor. Every month, I seemed to be sinking deeper into the quicksand. And when you're drowning, you reach for the people who should love you unconditionally, right? That's what I thought. That's what I desperately wanted to believe. I remember the day I went to my parents' house to ask for help. I wasn't asking for a free ride. I never have, and never will. What I needed was a short-term lifeline, a loan to cover rent, maybe help with a medical bill, just enough to stop the walls from caving in. I rehearsed my words in the car, parked outside their home, hands clenched around the steering wheel, until my knuckles were white. Their house looked the same as always. A neatly trimmed lawn, perfectly swept porch, everything in its place. On the surface, it was warm and inviting. But to me, walking up those steps felt like walking into a courtroom where I was already the defendant. Inside, I tried to keep my voice calm, measured. I explained my situation clearly. I thought if they saw how hard I was working, how much I was fighting to get back on my feet, they might show me a little grace. But the look my father gave me said it all. Cold, disapproving. My mother, always more subtle, tilted her head with that familiar mix of pity and disdain. Then came the words that burned themselves into my memory. "We're not here to bail out failures. Maybe if you were more like your brother, we wouldn't be having this conversation." It felt like the ground opened beneath me. For years, I had tried to ignore the favoritism, the constant comparisons. But in that moment, all the doubts I'd pushed away came roaring back. They weren't just choosing not to help me, they were declaring, in no uncertain terms, that I wasn't worth helping. I remember my throat tightening, the taste of iron as I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from crying in front of them. I managed to whisper something, "Maybe I understand," though I didn't understand at all. And then I left. I walked out of that house with nothing but the weight of their judgment pressing down on me, heavier than any debt collector's notice. That was the moment everything changed. The wound was carved deep. And it wasn't just financial, it was the kind of betrayal that reshapes how you see the people you once trusted most. Of course, I couldn't have known then that life had a strange symmetry planned for us. That one day, when the same parents who abandoned me would face their own disaster, they would come knocking on my door. And this time, the power would be in my hands. Walking away from my parents' house that day, I realized something I had been avoiding for years. This wasn't just a one-time cruelty. It was the culmination of a pattern. a pattern that had been quietly shaping my life since childhood. To make sense of that moment, I need to tell you about the people at the heart of this story, my family, and the roles we all played. Let me start with myself. I've always been the steady one, the one who followed the rules and carried the weight no one else wanted to. As the oldest child, it felt like responsibility had been stitched into my skin from the moment I could walk. Growing up, I helped my mother with chores, kept an eye on my younger brother, and later, I was the first to get a job, the first to start saving. I wasn't perfect, who is, but I was dependable, and for a long time, I thought that dependability would earn me respect. But in my parents' eyes, I was never the star. That spotlight belonged, entirely and effortlessly, to my younger brother. He was 2 years younger than me, and from the very beginning, he knew how to charm a room. Teachers loved him, neighbors adored him. Even relatives would pat him on the back and say, "He's going places." And maybe he was, but the truth no one wanted to admit was that his charm masked a streak of selfishness. He had a way of twisting situations so that rules bent in his favor, and somehow, he always walked away without consequence. If he brought home a bad grade, it was brushed off with excuses. If he crashed the family car as a teenager, my father laughed it off, saying, "Boys will be boys." When he started spending money recklessly in his 20s, designer clothes, expensive gadgets, nights out that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, my parents didn't question it. They praised him for living boldly. Meanwhile, I was treated like the cautionary tale. I worked hard, lived within my means, paid my bills, and yet, no matter how much I accomplished, it was never quite enough. If I got a promotion at work, my parents would ask why it wasn't a bigger one. If I saved up and bought a modest car, they'd suggest it wasn't as impressive as my brother's flashy lease. Every achievement of mine was measured against him, and somehow, I always came up short. My mother had a favorite phrase she used whenever the comparison came up. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" At first, I thought it was just a careless comment, but over time, I realized it was the foundation of how they saw us. To them, he could do no wrong. And me? I was the shadow, the reminder of what they didn't want. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs were everywhere. My brother's so-called success never made sense. His lifestyle was too extravagant for the jobs he claimed to have. There were whispers among relatives about his investments and business ventures, but no one ever saw any real proof. When I quietly raised my concerns, my parents shut me down with sharp words. "Don't be jealous. He's just more ambitious than you." It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that my parents not only ignored the truth but actively defended him, even against me. They believed in his illusion because it suited them. It gave them a golden sun to brag about, a shiny image to polish in front of the world. And me? I played my role as the responsible one, the forgotten one, until that day when I finally saw their favoritism for what it was. Their choice to cut me off wasn't a sudden decision. It was the natural outcome of a lifetime of comparison and dismissal. At the time, I didn't realize just how important that dynamic would become, because when everything eventually came crashing down, those same blind spots, their refusal to see him clearly, their obsession with appearances would be the very things that led to their downfall. After years of being compared to my brother and dismissed by my parents, I had learned to live with a quiet ache in my chest. The kind you carry when you know you're never quite enough for the people you love. But the day they cut me off, it wasn't just another comparison, another sigh of disappointment. It was the moment they made it crystal clear that, in their eyes, I wasn't worth saving. I remember every detail of that day. I had been juggling overdue bills, making desperate phone calls, stretching every dollar until it snapped. The stress was relentless. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to calculate how many hours of freelance work or temp jobs I would need, just to cover another week's expenses. I was exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally, and more than anything, I just wanted a shred of compassion. When I walked into my parents' living room, I told myself I wouldn't cry. I wanted to be calm, rational, composed. I sat on their perfect white sofa, with my mother perched across from me, her lips painted in her usual deep red, her eyes already sharp with judgment. My father sat in his recliner, his arms crossed like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. I explained my situation as best I could. I told them about the job I lost when my department was cut, how I was working odd jobs to keep afloat, how the medical bills were piling up faster than I could pay them. I admitted that I was struggling, words that tasted like defeat in my mouth. And then I asked, as carefully as I could, if they would consider helping me with a loan. Not a handout, not charity, just something to bridge the gap until I got back on my feet. My father didn't even pause before he shook his head. "We're not here to fix your mistakes," he said, his voice flat. "You need to take responsibility for your choices." My mother chimed in then, her tone dripping with that cold kind of pity that cuts deeper than outright anger. "Your brother never needs us like this. He's out there making real money, living boldly. You should be more like him instead of constantly struggling." It felt like a slap. No worse. At least a slap acknowledges your presence. Their words erased me, reduced me to nothing but a foil to their perfect sun. I sat there frozen, every muscle in my body tight. I wanted to argue, to scream that I wasn't irresponsible, that I was working myself to the bone. But what would have been the point? They had already made up their minds. To them, I was a failure not worth investing in. The silence stretched until I finally stood up. My legs felt heavy, my hands trembling as I clutched my bag. I think I mumbled something like "I understand" or "thanks anyway," though I didn't understand. And there was nothing to thank them for as I walked out the door. I knew something inside me had shifted. The house that once held childhood memories, birthdays, and holidays now felt like a stranger's home. I wasn't just walking away from their rejection, I was walking away from the last fragile illusion that they loved me unconditionally. That day was the line. The moment when my parents stopped being my safety net and became the very people I had to protect myself from. And though I couldn't see it then, their choice, their cruel, careless dismissal was the first domino. Because while they cut me off without hesitation, they would one day find themselves desperate, abandoned, and powerless, begging me for help they no longer deserved. In the weeks and months after that day, I kept my distance from my parents. Part of it was pride. I refused to crawl back after they made it so clear that I wasn't welcome. But part of it was survival. I couldn't afford the emotional toll of facing them. Not when every ounce of energy I had was going into simply staying afloat. Still, family ties have a way of pulling you back, even when you know better. I would see them at holidays or family gatherings, and every time, the dynamic was the same. My parents, glowing with pride, held my brother up like a trophy. Me? I was the footnote in the story. The one they only mentioned to highlight how much brighter his star supposedly shined. At Thanksgiving, for example, while I quietly helped set the table and made sure everyone had enough to eat, my parents boasted loudly about my brother's investments. He had, according to them, bought into some sort of high-return venture with a group of partners. I remember my mother's voice, sharp with satisfaction, That's what success looks like. He's smart with money, not constantly asking for help like some people." The words hit their mark. Even though she never said my name, I felt my cheeks flush, my fork heavy in my hand. I wanted to point out that I had never asked them for help again, that I had swallowed their rejection and carried on without complaint. But what would have been the point? Their narrative was already written, and in it, I was cast as the failure. Meanwhile, my brother basked in the attention. He wore expensive suits to family dinners, flashing a watch that probably cost more than I earned in 3 months. He ordered drinks without looking at the price, telling stories about deals and profits that sounded rehearsed and vague. I noticed that whenever anyone asked for details, what company he was working with, who these partners were, he would change the subject or toss out jargon that didn't quite make sense. But my parents didn't care. To them, the flash was enough. They loved the appearance of success, the shiny surface. They paraded him in front of relatives, bragged to neighbors, and used his lifestyle as a weapon to shame me. I kept my observations to myself, but inside, I couldn't ignore the unease building in me. Something about my brother's story didn't add up. He was living far beyond his means, and his income streams were never clear. It didn't take a financial expert to realize that something shady was going on. I tried to raise my concerns once, just once, in a quiet conversation with my mother. I said gently, "Don't you ever wonder where all the money comes from? He doesn't have a stable job." She didn't even let me finish. She waved her hand dismissively, her face pinched with irritation. "You've always been jealous. Just because he's more ambitious than you doesn't mean you get to tear him down." That was the moment I realized the truth. They didn't just prefer him. They were actively invested in protecting the illusion of his success. No matter what reality said, they needed him to be the golden child, because admitting otherwise would mean admitting they had chosen wrong all along. So the months dragged on. I worked my jobs, paid my bills, and rebuilt my life in quiet determination. Meanwhile, my brother lived large, and my parents cheered him on like proud fans in the front row. But what I didn't know then was that all of this, their arrogance, their blindness, his recklessness, was only setting the stage. Every boast, every cruel dismissal, every willful ignorance was fuel for the fire that was already smoldering beneath the surface. And when it finally caught flame, it would consume everything they thought they had built. Up until that point, I had tolerated the humiliation. I swallowed my parents' barbed comments, endured their endless comparisons, and let my brother strut around with his hollow victories. I told myself that keeping my distance was enough, that if I focused on rebuilding my own life, I could eventually detach from their poisonous dynamic. But then he crossed a line that was aimed directly at me. It started with something small, something I almost brushed off. I noticed a charge on one of my bank accounts that I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was a billing error. I called the bank, fully expecting to have it sorted out in minutes. Instead, the representative calmly explained that the transfer had been made using my login information. That chilled me to the bone. I knew immediately who it was. My brother had always been reckless, but he wasn't stupid. He knew how to manipulate people, how to worm his way into situations. Years earlier, when I was still trying to be a good sister, I had once logged into my account on his laptop to help him pay a shared family expense. Apparently, he had saved the details. The bank traced the transfer to one of his accounts. There was no denying it. He had stolen from me. I felt my face burn with a mix of rage and disbelief. He had all the advantages, all the support, all the parental praise, and yet it still wasn't enough. He had to take from me to me, the sister who had already been left to fight her battles alone. I confronted him, of course. I called him, my voice shaking but firm. "Why did you take money from me?" I demanded. He laughed. Actually laughed. "Relax. It's just a few hundred. I'll pay you back when I can. Don't be so dramatic." Those words snapped something inside me. It wasn't the money, it was the utter contempt in his tone. The ease with which he dismissed my anger. To him, I wasn't even a person worth respecting. I was just another resource to exploit. And when I turned to my parents, foolishly hoping for support, they didn't hesitate to take his side. "Don't exaggerate," my father said. "I'm sure he'll pay you back." My mother added, "You really should stop being so jealous. He's building something big, and you should be proud instead of trying to drag him down." That was the breaking point. I remember hanging up the phone after that conversation, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might split my ribs. A cold clarity washed over me. I could no longer wait for them to see the truth on their own. They would never see it, not until the illusion shattered in front of them. From that moment forward, I stopped being the quiet, patient victim. I still kept my distance, still played the role of the forgotten child to their faces. But inside, I made a decision. If there ever came a chance to expose my brother for what he truly was, I would take it, and I wouldn't hesitate. I didn't know how or when that chance would come, but I knew it would, because men like my brother, their greed always outruns their luck. And when the fall comes, it comes hard. After my brother stole from me, and my parents defended him yet again, something inside me hardened. I stopped expecting fairness from them. I stopped hoping for acknowledgement, for love expressed in the way I needed it. Instead, I poured everything into myself. It wasn't easy. I was still living paycheck to paycheck, still climbing out of the pit I'd been shoved into. But I worked tirelessly, taking side jobs, budgeting every cent, learning new skills so I could move into a more stable career. Slowly, the pieces began to come together. My independence wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every dollar I earned was proof that I could survive without their approval. I thought that would be the end of the story. I imagined I'd build a life quietly apart from them, while my brother continued his charade with my parents applauding from the sidelines. But life has a way of circling back, of placing truth in your lap when you least expect it. It happened by chance one evening. I was cleaning out some old boxes I'd stored in my small apartment, looking for paperwork I needed for tax season. Among the folders was one I didn't recognize, thin, unmarked. Inside were photocopies of documents, contracts, receipts, and ledgers with my brother's name scribbled across them. At first, I thought maybe he had left them behind years ago when he borrowed some of my things. But as I skimmed through the pages, my blood ran cold. The papers weren't ordinary receipts. They were proof of something far darker: false business filings, investor agreements that didn't match reality, and financial transfers that suggested he was moving large sums of money between shell accounts. The more I read, the more I realized what I was holding: evidence of embezzlement. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, the stack of papers spread out in front of me like puzzle pieces I hadn't asked for. My brother wasn't just irresponsible or reckless. He was a thief, a fraud. And if the numbers were correct, he wasn't stealing pennies. He was moving millions. The realization left me breathless. All those years of suspicion, all those vague business ventures he bragged about, it was all smoke and mirrors. And the worst part was, my parents had bought into it completely. They weren't just blind, they were complicit in preserving the illusion, because admitting the truth would shatter their pride. But now, I had something they didn't, something even my brother couldn't charm his way out of. I had proof. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, vindication, fear. Part of me wanted to march straight to my parents, slam the documents down on their perfect dining table, and watch their faces crumble. But another part of me knew better. This wasn't a fight to win with words. This was a fight that required patience, precision, and timing. So I tucked the folder away in a locked drawer, my hands trembling as I slid the key into place. I didn't know exactly when I'd use it, but deep down, I knew the day was coming. Because people like my brother always go too far, and when he did, I would be ready. That folder wasn't just paper. It was my weapon, the truth, sharpened into a blade. And when the time came, I would use it. For a long time, I kept that folder locked away, almost like a secret I wasn't ready to face. Life went on, and I focused on building my independence brick by brick. But in the back of my mind, I knew the day would come when those papers would no longer sit quietly in a drawer. That day arrived with a phone call. It was a chilly morning. One of those days where you're grateful just to have a hot cup of coffee in your hands. I was getting ready for work when my phone buzzed with a call from a distant cousin. She never called unless something was wrong. Her voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial, as she said, "Have you heard about your brother? There are rumors, serious ones. Something about missing money from his company." My stomach tightened. I knew immediately what she was talking about. This was at the moment the cracks were finally starting to show. Over the next few weeks, whispers turned into headlines. Articles began surfacing online about an internal audit at the firm my brother claimed to be part of. Investors were panicking. Large sums, millions, were unaccounted for. My parents, of course, dismissed it all as jealous rivals trying to ruin his reputation. But I knew better. I had known better for years. I pulled out the folder from my drawer one evening and laid everything out again. The documents aligned perfectly with the rumors. My brother had been moving money through a web of false accounts, and now the trail was unraveling. I didn't hesitate this time. The next morning, I contacted the firm's legal department. I introduced myself, explained my connection, and told them I had documents they would want to see. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that carries both shock and urgency. They arranged for me to meet with their investigators. When I walked into that sleek, glass-walled office a few days later, I carried the folder tucked neatly under my arm. My heart raced, but my steps were steady. This wasn't about revenge in the heat of anger anymore. This was about truth, about justice, not just for me, but for every person he had deceived. The investigators combed through the documents with wide eyes, asking pointed questions, snapping photos, jotting notes. They thanked me again and again, telling me this could be the missing piece that tied everything together. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in years. For so long, I had carried the weight of being dismissed, humiliated, overshadowed. But now, for the first time, I was no longer powerless. I had turned the very evidence of his corruption into a weapon, and I had delivered it directly into the hands of those who could bring him down. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The audit turned into a full-blown investigation. Authorities got involved. Subpoenas were issued, bank records combed through, and suddenly the image of my brother, the charming, successful golden boy, began to crack under the pressure. Meanwhile, my parents were scrambling, clinging desperately to denial. They called relatives, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. They repeated the same tired refrain: "Our son is ambitious, not dishonest." But the walls were closing in, and there was nothing they could do to hold them back. For me, There was no glee in watching it unfold, just a deep, quiet satisfaction. This wasn't a petty revenge fantasy. This was justice, pure and simple. He had built his empire on lies and theft, and now those lies were collapsing under their own weight. And though I didn't know it yet, the real climax wasn't just in the exposure of his crimes. It was in what came next when my parents, the very people who had abandoned me in my time of need, would turn to me with desperate, pleading eyes. The news spread like wildfire. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was headlines, court filings, and televised reports. My brother, the golden son, the one they had paraded in front of neighbors and relatives, was officially under investigation for embezzling millions. I still remember the day the story broke on the local news. I was at home, folding laundry, the TV murmuring in the background, when I heard his name. I froze, a shirt half folded in my hands. As the anchor calmly reported, company officials allege over $2.5 million has been misappropriated. An arrest warrant has been issued. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from vindication. The truth, long buried under layers of denial and arrogance, was finally staring the world in the face. And that's when my phone began to ring. First, it was my mother. Her voice was frantic, quivering. "Please, you have to help your brother. They've made a terrible mistake. You've always been level-headed. You can talk to people, explain things. You can convince them he didn't mean it." Her words were tumbling over each other, desperate and incoherent. It was almost surreal, hearing the same woman who once looked me in the eye and said I wasn't worth saving, now begging for my intervention. Then came my father's call, sterner but no less desperate. "You need to do something. This family's reputation is on the line. You can't just sit back while your brother is destroyed. Call a lawyer, pull some strings. You owe it to this family." I actually laughed out loud, a sound that surprised even me. 4 years, I had carried their judgments in silence. 4 years, I had begged for scraps of compassion they refused to give. And now, suddenly, I was the one they were leaning on. When I spoke, my voice was calm, steady. "Do you remember the day I came to you, asking for help? I was drowning, and you told me I wasn't worth it. You told me to be more like him. Well, here we are. This is who he is. And no, I won't help you." There was silence on the line. I could almost hear the weight of my words settling in, like stones sinking into deep water. My mother finally whispered, "But you're his sister. You can't just let this happen." I took a breath, steadying myself, and replied, "He made his choices, just like you made yours when you turned your backs on me. You'll have to live with both." The phone call ended with muffled sobs on her end, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one pleading. I wasn't the one silenced or shamed. They were. Days later, I watched as my brother was led into court in handcuffs, his once arrogant grin replaced with a hollow, panicked stare. My parents sat behind him, pale and trembling, their pride shattered into pieces too sharp to pick up. It was everything I had always been denied. Acknowledgement, proof, justice. Not because I screamed louder, not because I fought for their approval, but because the truth, when finally revealed, doesn't need defending. The golden boy had fallen, and the parents who worshipped him were left exposed, powerless, and humiliated. And me? I had never felt stronger. The day of my brother's sentencing is etched into my memory like a painting you can't look away from, even if the colors are harsh. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters, their cameras flashing, microphones pointed like arrows toward anyone even remotely connected to the case. I didn't want to go at first. Part of me thought, what good will it do to see him again? But another part of me, the part that had carried years of dismissal, the part that still remembered walking out of my parents' house empty-handed, knew I needed to be there, not for him, not for them, but for myself. When I walked into that courtroom, I saw him immediately. My brother sat at the defendant's table, wearing a suit that no longer carried the sheen of luxury. His hair was disheveled, his face pale. The arrogance he once wore like a crown was gone. He looked small, fragile even, and for the first time in my life, I saw him without the golden glow my parents had wrapped him in. He was just a man, broken, guilty, exposed. My parents were there too, seated in the gallery, their hands clutching each other's as though they were the ones on trial. My mother's makeup couldn't hide the puffiness around her eyes, and my father's shoulders sagged in a way I'd never seen before. They looked older, diminished, as though the weight of their choices had finally come crashing down. The judge read the charges: multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, theft. The total amount stolen, $2.5 million. Each number echoed through the courtroom like a drumbeat, each count stripping away another layer of the illusion my parents had so carefully maintained. When the sentence was handed down, years in prison, restitution to investors, and the forfeiture of assets, there was no drama, no outburst. My brother just lowered his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. For once, there was no speech, no excuses, no charm to shield him, just silence. And that silence was deafening. I glanced over at my parents. My mother was crying quietly, her shoulders shaking. My father sat rigid, his face blank, as if refusing to show emotion could somehow undo the reality in front of him. But I saw it, the defeat, the shame, the unraveling of everything they had built their pride upon. And then, almost as if by instinct, both of them turned their eyes toward me. It was fleeting, just a moment, but I'll never forget it. In that look was everything they had never said: pleas for help, regrets unspoken, the acknowledgement that I had been right all along. But I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held their gaze with the calm steadiness I had built in the silence of my own battles. Because the truth was, I didn't need to say anything. The justice unfolding before us said it all. The irony was almost poetic. For years, they told me to be more like him. For years, they dismissed me, humiliated me, cut me off. And in the end, the very qualities they mocked me for, my steadiness, my integrity, my refusal to take shortcuts, were the qualities that saved me. While the son they idolized was led away in handcuffs, I walked out of that courtroom free, strong, and unbroken. That moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about vindication. It was about closure. It was the sharp, clean slice that finally severed me from the weight of their judgment. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, I felt lighter than I had in years. For once, the story wasn't theirs to control. It was mine, and it had finally, beautifully, come full circle. Life has a way of moving on, even after earthquakes like the one that shook my family. The weeks after my brother's sentencing were strange, quiet in a way, but charged with the echoes of everything that had collapsed. For my parents, the fallout was brutal. Their perfect image, the one they had spent decades polishing, shattered overnight. The neighbors who once praised their golden son now whispered behind their backs. Friends they had bragged to stopped inviting them to dinner. Even within the family, there was a distance and uncomfortable silence at gatherings where no one dared to mention the trial. But everyone thought of it all the same. They tried, of course, to reach out to me. There were tentative phone calls, voicemails that started with forced cheerfulness and ended in trembling apologies. My mother once left a message saying, "We just want our family back together again. We made mistakes, but we need you now." I listened to those messages, but I never called back. At least not right away. The wounds they had left in me weren't the kind that healed with a few words or crocodile tears. And deep down, I knew what they wanted wasn't reconciliation, it was rescue. They wanted me to step back into the role of the dependable daughter, the fixer, the one who carried the weight. But I had carried enough. Instead, I focused on my own life. My career stabilized. I moved into a better apartment, one I could decorate in colors and textures that felt like home. I built a circle of friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. And most importantly, I learned how to trust myself again, to look in the mirror and see someone strong, resilient, and worthy whether or not my parents ever acknowledged it. As for my brother, prison stripped him of everything he once flaunted. The cars, the watches, the tailored suits, they were gone, seized by the courts. He went from luxury to a concrete cell, from adoration to disgrace. And though I don't rejoice in anyone's suffering, there was a grim symmetry in it all. He had built his life on lies, and in the end, those lies became the walls that trapped him. Occasionally, I hear updates, someone mentioning how he's adjusting, or how my parents drive hours every month to visit him. But I don't go. That chapter is closed for me. My role in his story ended the day I handed over that folder of evidence. Do I regret it? Not for a second. Justice isn't always comfortable, but it is always necessary. And in this case, it was long overdue. I sometimes think back to the day I left my parents' house after they cut me off. I remember the weight of their words, the humiliation, the loneliness. And then I compare it to the day I walked out of the courthouse, my head held high, the sun on my face. The difference between those two versions of me is everything. I am no longer the forgotten daughter, the shadow to their golden boy. I am my own person, strong, self-made, and free. The moral of my story is simple. When people choose status and illusions over love and integrity, they will always, eventually, pay the price. My parents thought they were cutting off their weakest link, but in the end, the child they dismissed was the one who survived. And the son they idolized? He was the one who brought them to their knees. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.